Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Miala Annual Conference virtual breakout session. I'm your session moderator, Ida Martinez, and I have a few housekeeping items to share with you. We ask that you keep your microphone on mute until you need to ask a question. You can ask your questions at any time by entering them in the chat. We'll be saving all questions until the end of the presentation. After the session, please take a moment to provide feedback to our presenters by filling out the session's evaluation form located in the conference portal. Today's presentation is Pivot, Turning Obstacles Beyond Our Control into Powerful Instructional Assessment Opportunities. Your presenter is Amanda Nichols-Hess. Amanda, the Zoom room is yours.
Thank you so much, Ida, and thank you everybody for being here today. Hope you're having a good day so far, and I see some names I recognize, so thanks for being here with me today. So I am Amanda Nichols-Hess. This is me, admittedly pre-pandemic and second child. So when you see me when I turn my camera on, don't be too surprised if I look a little bit more haggard after the last year, especially. I have my camera off right now. I'll turn it on at the end for Q&A just to preserve some bandwidth, but also to lessen the cognitive load. So you know where to look. You don't have to worry about looking at me and looking at the slides. So I'm the coordinator of instruction and research help at Oakland University, and I'm also the education librarian. So if you don't mind now putting in chat where you are and maybe what your role is, that would be great. Just so we kind of know who's in the room with us today. Not to overload the chat, but I'll keep going as if you could maybe just put your institution and maybe your role in chat, that would be great. All right, great. I see. Our first two are STEM librarians. Exciting. Thanks, everybody. It's all coming in all at once, it seems. So it's great to be here with you today, and I look forward to learning from you and me engage in some brainstorming activities, and hopefully I have some useful information to share as well. So in today's session, my goals are that you'll be able to define indirect, formative, and summative assessment in the context of online information literacy instruction, and identify at least one area of your instructional practices where you could collect new information for assessment, especially instructional assessment purposes. So now that you've told me where you're all coming from, I'd like to know what brings you here today. So please, again, continue to feel free to put your responses in chat, but I'd like to jump into a poll everywhere. I'm going to pop that into that link into chat, so you should be able to get quick access to it. But I'd like to know why you're here today. Are you just curious? Are you looking for something to apply now? Are you looking for information that you can share with other people? Or is there another reason that you'd, oops, it's not active now, that you've come here today? So if you could respond to the poll, or if you have another reason that you're here that's not reflected, please feel free to share that in chat as well. Okay, so some curiosity, some strategies, seeking strategies, information to share with others. Okay, so some curiosity, that's great. It's great to be curious, especially if we still have curiosity in us after the last 15 months. Lots of curiosity, wonderful. And Allison indicates that they're looking for examples to apply today. Okay, great. Well, hopefully we can get to those, accomplish all of those goals today. So I'm going to jump into one more poll, although the answers are constantly changing as your responses come in. It's kind of fun to watch. And now I'm wondering about what your experience is with instructional assessment. So again, if you have Poll Everywhere open, it should automatically display. If not, you can go back to that pollev.com/AmandaHess793 link and just share what's your experience with instructional assessment. Oh, we got an assessment is my jam person. Awesome. Well, I hope that person will share their expertise and ideas with us as well. But I think I fall into the category of I'm more knowledgeable than I ever expected to be, especially after the last year or so. I think we've all learned lots of things that we didn't maybe expect to. But seems like people have some experience at least with assessment. So hopefully we can build on that knowledge and those experiences and develop some new ideas that we all can integrate into our practices. Okay, thank you, everybody. So moving on, I just want to give you an outline of what to expect. So we have only 45 minutes today. We'll take about 10 minutes of that for questions, but I do want to cover 4 areas that I think will be helpful to give you a sense of what I've done and what I've learned, and hopefully help you with some takeaways as well. So I'm going to begin by very briefly framing assessment and assessment terms for our purposes. I'm then going to talk about instruction and assessment and moving those pieces online and what that looked like for me, moving that kind of content online in the last year. Then we'll discuss and examine some data that I've collected in aggregate at pretty broad levels with an eye toward the future. And then I'll wrap up by talking about my own conclusions and my own next steps, as well as some takeaways that I can see for other people's practices. Let's begin by framing instructional assessment and defining some key terms. So, especially our person who assessment is their jam, I'm sure that these are familiar to you, and maybe if you've engaged in other assessment activities, these might sound familiar. But there are 3 ideas that are really core to what I'm going to talk about today. So we have indirect assessment, which involves gathering data from methods or measurements that aren't real world work samples. So could be observation of behavior, interviews with people, or surveys, for instance. Formative assessment is formative assessment in instruction, involves monitoring individuals' learning as they're working. So checking for their understanding and providing feedback as they practice a concept or work with an idea, and sort of course correcting as needed along the way. And then summative assessment in instruction involves evaluating learners' performance or their understanding at the end of something. So here I've called it a unit. Could be a course unit, could be a course itself, could be a class session, right? Some other endpoint that we might define. And this kind of assessment, the points awarded or the grade that's conferred often have a larger impact on an overall grade, like in a course, for example. So these are often referred to high stakes assessments, whereas formative is more low stakes, because if there are points assigned or there's like a point value associated with that kind of assessment, it's smaller and doesn't have quite as big of an impact on, for example, a student's grade. So for concrete examples of each of these terms, although maybe some have come to mind based on those definitions, indirect assessment might be a student survey that asks them to reflect on what they've learned or what they feel capable of doing now after a learning experience. Whereas formative assessment could be when students are engaging in class activities, when those happen again, if they're not already happening for you, and they get immediate feedback from you or from another librarian or from their instructor. So like, think about if you ask students to demonstrate a searching strategy and somebody comes up in front of the class and shows that strategy and how they enacted a strategy for their own research topic, for example, and you provide feedback or make suggestions, right? That would be kind of formative assessment within an in-person classroom setting. And then summative assessment would involve things like learning objects that are final papers or final projects, exams, or those other large assignments that students submit to show what they've learned or what they can do as a result of their learning experience. So at this point, I know we're early in here, but I'd like to jump into our first active learning activity. We're going to have 3 of these throughout our session today. I could talk at you for a long time, but I prefer not to. So we're going to be using Google Jamboard, which is an interactive whiteboard. And right now I'd like you to think about what kind of assessment would be most useful for you in your context and why. So is it indirect, formative, summative? What kind of assessment would be useful for you? So we'll just take a couple of minutes to do this activity, and I'll share the link with you in chat. So it's case sensitive. Let me just copy and paste it and pop it into chat here for you. Oops. Wrong link. Too many tabs open here. So this should take you to our Jamboard, which I will open up. And you should see this brainstorming activity. I'm going to keep this screen shared so that everybody can kind of see as the responses come in. So what kinds of instructional assessment would be useful in your context and why? And so how you can add your thoughts to this Jamboard is to click on this sticky note icon and then say indirect helps me to reflect on my own performances, for example. And then if you just hit save, it will place your sticky note, and of course you can move it around. So tell us and share with us what kinds of instructional assessment would be most useful in your context. While we do this, I'm going to play a little background music because I always find these silences a little bit awkward, just to maybe get you thinking a little bit. And I find that sometimes in Jamboard, all the the sticky notes appear all of a sudden at one time. So if you're all working and typing, they might all stack on top of each other. So please feel free to move them around. So formative assessment helps us to see how students are immediately doing, right? Determining which direction an instruction session should take, great. Engaging with students, using formative to help students learn, and then summative because instructors want a grade for the grade book. Yes, of course, that's both have really useful purposes, some for us and some for instructors who we're working with. Using both formative and summative regularly in almost all lesson plans. It's very helpful to have both, I agree, and I think they give us different senses of or different understandings or different takeaways, right? Indirect, another person has put indirect in addition to my sample there. Surveys or interviews to assess reference or research service. Yep, absolutely. Indirect, helping students to see or helping you to see students can apply what they've learned throughout the session. Okay, great. So it looks like we have a mix here. People are using formative assessment especially, which is great. I think that's often a really easy way for us to integrate some reflective assessment practices in our instruction, whether that's online or in person. Some people are using both. We have definitely some summative assessment, which I think is sort of like the big goal of most assessment, right? You want to see that big high stakes assessment. You want to see student performance in that way, but different kinds of assessment can be helpful throughout the course of our instruction and teaching and students learning. So we'll take maybe another 15 seconds or so, and then we'll move on to, when we jump back into our slideshow, and we will come back to these activities. So you'll have another chance to respond in just a little bit. I'm going to move some of these sticky notes because we got them all stacked up here. Great. Okay.
This
So
was
with
fun,
that,
Amanda, just telling you.
oh, good. I'm glad. Well, after the session, I will share the link to this Jamboard, so you will be able to view it, not edit it afterwards, but so you'll get this. So don't worry. If you want to refer back to it, you always can. And feel free to continue to put ideas down if you want. We'll go back to there in the future, I promise. So from that very brief, very high level kind of view of some very basic assessment terms, I want to share some more specific information about my own experiences in taking my instruction online in the last year. And throughout that, I'm going to emphasize formative and summative assessment. So again, I told you a little bit about my context at the very beginning, but let me flesh that out a little bit, just because I think understanding where I'm coming from will help to frame what I've done in terms of instructional assessment, and maybe will help you to think about what might work for you. So as I said, I'm the education librarian, which for me means I'm the liaison to our School of Education and Human Services. So not all teachers, but mostly teachers and administrators, or teachers to be. Our undergraduate programs are really heavily grounded in pedagogy, so in-class work, hands-on kinds of experiences. So our teachers in training don't get much in the way of academic research experiences. My instruction load is pretty large, but it's specifically grounded with graduate students and in graduate student coursework. So this instruction happens primarily for me in the fall semester because our graduate students work in cohorts, and my instruction has often been one-shots or orientation type sessions within those cohorts, despite my very best efforts otherwise, and my activity to try and do something different. So along with that, very heavy instructional load in the fall with graduate students, this was primarily always face-to-face. Lots of visiting classes, sometimes on campus, sometimes off campus, weekends, evenings. I had a very limited online instructional presence, although I'd really been trying very consistently to get the faculty in my school on board with a more flipped approach. I know many people are way beyond that point, but surprisingly, the faculty who are teaching pedagogy are not real keen on really engaging pedagogy with their own learners sometimes, I have found, which is a little bit frustrating to me. But I've been trying to increase the online learning options for these graduate students who are often working adults, who have families and many responsibilities, and for whom a class once a week or sometimes even once a month just doesn't cut it in terms of the instructional support they need for using the library. Part of my faculty's hesitance to maybe engage in online learning may be because of our institution's learning management system. So we use Moodle, which you may have used. Many institutions have moved away from Moodle, but we have Moodle. It can be a very clunky and challenging tool to use on both the instructor side and on the student side. So it's not the most intuitive user interface or instructor interface for that matter. And in that same vein, the library content isn't easy to integrate into an online course. Our developers don't have like predefined library blocks or chunks or content that faculty can just plug right into their online courses in any discipline. So what that does is that's really put the onus on us in the library to really advocate for getting into online courses, and it makes it a very labor-intensive process for both the faculty and for the librarians. So with all that in mind, I want to just share also where I am at in terms of my instructional assessment. So in my instruction, I regularly offer students in those in-person sessions with opportunities for indirect assessment. Namely, I'm providing feedback surveys at the end of each class that ask students to reflect on what they learned, what was most useful, where they still have questions, along with, the formative assessment where I'm walking around and helping students in class sessions where it's less of a library orientation and more of an engaged learning session where students are applying the concepts hands-on in real time. However, with that said, I'm pretty familiar with a range of classroom assessment techniques, and I've even led my colleagues through some professional learning experiences on how we could use these in our instruction in low-tech and high-tech ways. So although my instructional assessment in the past has been pretty limited, I would say, to mostly indirect and some formative assessment, I had some tools in my tool belt that I was kind of waiting to use and deploy, but hadn't had the opportunity to do so before COVID. And finally, I think it's also really important as I share some of the online assessment that I did and the information I've collected and just sort of the takeaways I have to acknowledge that I'm really experienced with online learning. We have a credit bearing course at Oakland, and I've been an instructor in that course several times. And so this involves both getting very comfortable with our online learning management system, but also in a credit bearing course, there are many opportunities for formative and then also summative assessment. So I've developed experience in that online assessment through this credit bearing course, which has served me well and been really invaluable in the work that I've done this semester or this academic year, really. So you maybe were waiting for this reference at this slide when you saw the title of this presentation. If you wondered when Ross Geller from Friends was going to show up, here he is. So this is to say, in the midst of all of my instructional context and assessment content, COVID came. So if you're not familiar with this GIF, Ross is trying to get a couch up a stairwell. It can't fit. He's panicking. He's yelling, I think, at Rachel Green on the other side, who, if I look at the back of her head, and is yelling pivot. So of course, if we think about it, I'm sure that there are many times that where's my text here? Have felt like Ross Geller in the last 15 months. And really, it's not if we felt like this, like we're panicking and we're not sure what to do. It's more about how many times have we felt like this in the last 15 months, right? Yeah, so I think it's important to acknowledge, I should say the elephant in the room, right? But really it's the couch and the stairwell in this case. So the obvious takeaway from all of this context, my instructional context and the assessment context in which I've been working, is that come 2020, everything had to change. So I moved all of my instruction online, which was really a surefire way to get more embedded in online courses. Not maybe the way I was hoping, but certainly that's the silver lining there. So, but when I made this shift, I was really cognizant of three core ideas: comfort, use, and tech support. So first, in terms of comfort, I needed to make sure that the faculty I worked with felt comfortable with shifting library instruction, which had been very sort of traditional, for lack of a better way to describe it, all online. And I needed them to buy into the fact that we could engage in meaningful learning online, and that online learning could really better serve their students than a Zoom session at the end of a workday when their students had been teaching online all day, perhaps, and everyone was really burned out. Second, I needed to ensure that any content I developed was actually used, and that it was used effectively and used in the right ways in each course and at the right sort of time and situated within the instruction at the right point. And then third, I knew that I needed to offer support technologically, both to the students who were in these courses and also to the faculty often too, who were everyone was dealing with something that was, an added layer of new on an already very, very challenging time, to put it mildly. So as I made the shift online in instruction, and I dealt with and thought about these three core principles or issues that I wanted to make sure I addressed, I had three kinds of resources at my disposal that inform my in-person instruction pre-COVID. So I always create a lesson plan for any class session I teach that includes prompts. It aligns my instruction with different learning outcomes, gives me cues and activities that I want students to do. And this is a holdover from being a K-12 educator, and still something that I do and find really useful. I also always create a handout, which is an old habit, ironically, from my time as a technology trainer. It doesn't seem like those two things fit together, but I worked with teachers in using technology in K-12 education. And I found that they, just like my students now, who are teachers and administrators, appreciate a kind of quick resource and a brightly colored paper that they can grab and pull out when they need it. And of course, probably like all of you, I always create and update course guides or course pages to library resources on our library website. Every semester I'm teaching, I'm always revising those course pages, updating them, refreshing them, and making sure the information is up to date and consistent. So how did I use these as building blocks to going online? And then how did these pieces influence my online assessment? So the lesson plan for each course that I had developed already and that I had for all the courses I taught in person in the past served as a starting point for the online content that I then created. The handout also informed this content, but I also replicated this resource as an online tool that students could quickly refer to in the online environment as well. And I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. And then as I was developing new online learning content, I modified all of the course pages that I'd created to more closely mimic or mirror how the online learning resources looked and worked in more intentional ways. So when I broke content apart, when I tried to make it more manageable or chunk it out, I tried to do the same on my course guides and course pages so that it was easier for students to kind of find what they were looking for no matter where they were looking. So online, then what I was able to do is I was able to take what I'd created in person and translate it into learning objects that help me to gather indirect, formative, and summative assessment information. So I was creating this content in our learning management system, which I said is Moodle. And in our learning management system, we collect data such as user logs, time on task, the sequence of activities that users click through, etc. All kinds of like big brothery kind of information. But this really helped me to understand, and I saw this kind of information as indirect assessment data. It gave me a window into, as students were engaging with these kinds of learning activities, what were they doing? How long were they working with something? Where did they go after? How long did it take them to use different resources? Also, in the learning content, I built in formative assessment activities, often that were free response, where students could engage with the content as they went along, and then I could provide feedback from a distance in kind of an asynchronous way on things like search terms or research questions, that kind of thing. And then in terms of the summative assessment piece, each online learning resource that I created for each course had a summative assessment in the form of a final quiz, which students could complete and earn a credential with a score of at least 80%. So they got like a badge of completion for that course that they could share with their instructor to prove they had completed it. So with all that information, let me show you what this actually looks like. So when I say Moodle's not the most user-friendly, you can see it looks a little bit, not too many bells and whistles here, but this is what students basically encountered. This is content that I created for Early Childhood 6600, which is an introductory graduate level course for our Early Childhood Education Master's Program. So as you can see here, the list of exercises, there's one where they just need to get started, which introduces me and how they can get help in the library. But then there are 6 exercises that they needed to work through that I tried to chunk out content, break it up into smaller but meaningful pieces of information. Then they could work through those in any order, but ideally in sequence. And once they completed all of those 6 exercises, then this micro course assessment was open to them. And so here, once they've completed those exercises, they could take this assessment. And if they scored at least 8 out of 10 or 80%, they would earn that credential of completion. So here too, this is the link. I mentioned that I have those handouts that I've turned online, so no more wasting paper, right? Here's my handout that's a Google Doc that they can download or refer to online. And then if we had any live sessions, so often what I would do is I would have students work through this content and then offer a live session for students so they could have that connection piece with me, which the faculty really found very valuable and find very valuable consistently about me coming to their classes. So that allowed them to put a face with, you know, the online content and with a voice online and just let them know who they need to reach out to if they need help with their research. So also, let me jump now into an example of what the content looks like within this learning management system. So you can see, not too flashy, pretty basic. It's text, it's links, it's images, right? So it's not super necessarily, like I said, flashy content, but hopefully it's getting the point across for the students. You can see also, just to help them as they're working through this content, we have navigation here along the bottom. There's a progress bar here that says you have completed at this point 33% of the lesson, but there's also a menu. So it tells them what to expect. It gives them kind of a roadmap of what they can expect in this particular exercise on identifying a research topic. And then let me show you an example of what some of my formative assessment questions looked like. So this would be an example of an essay question, a free response essay question that students could respond to, share their research topic, start to look for information about how they could develop their topic. And again, this is kind of information that I had never had previously from students in any sort of documented way. And then I'll show you an example of what a summative question looked like on that final exam. And I just want to point out that as I was screenshotting this, I noticed a typo. And, you know, students are normally really great about telling us where we have those typos. So I'm surprised, but I thought I would just acknowledge that that typo was there and they never busted me on it all year. So Liz has asked in chat if these were standalone courses. And so this was a standalone course shell, which I'm happy to provide access to. It was through just one link, and students accessed it with their university ID and password. And so instead of building this into faculty's courses, I sort of built it separately, and then the faculty linked students to this resource. So then students could work through it on their own. And I'll talk a little bit about why I made that choice a little bit later, but I'm happy to, after our session, share the link with you all and share our guest user login name, just in case you want to look at any of this content. But thank you, Liz. That's an important question and something I definitely needed to point out. So with that sort of like fire hose approach, I know I blasted a lot of information at you. I'd like to know more about your content and your context now. So what existing content do you have that you could pivot from face-to-face to an online format? Or at this point, maybe what content did you pivot from face-to-face to online in the last year? And how could you integrate some sort of assessment into that content? So this is our second brainstorming activity. So we're going to jump again into Jamboard. I'll put that link into chat one more time, just so that it's right in front of everybody. I'll display it on the screen as well. So here's that link. And here is our Jamboard. So we're going to jump to our next Jamboard. So you need to use the navigation at the very top of your screen, right in the middle there, to jump into our second brainstorming activity if you can. And so again, what existing content do you have that you can pivot into an online format, or that you've already pivoted into an online format? And what might you integrate in terms of assessment into this kind of online format? Again, maybe you've already done it, but ideally, if there are ideas that maybe come to mind based on what we've talked about so far about how you might integrate assessment into it going forward, that would be great. So again, go ahead and pop a sticky note in just to share your thoughts. So let's see. So here we have some coming in. Excuse me while I take a quick drink. I'll mute myself so you don't have to listen to that.
Amanda, I'll just say at this point that we have about 5 or 6 minutes until Q&A.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we have people who have moved content into Google Forms or moving orientation online with an evaluative assessment. Big pivot, several new lessons, avoiding plagiarism in the similar way that we have something the same as well. Lots of tutorials, but no assessment that accompanies them. In-class activities into online activities. So these are some really great ideas, and I definitely want to look at them in more depth, and I hope you will as well once we have a little bit more time after our session. So pivoting face-to-face instruction into WebEx. And so that was something that I really struggled with, is how to use, that was a hard thing for me to conceptualize, like active learning and really meaningful assessment. So if you've done that, that would be great. So yeah, it looks like people have a lot of different ideas here. So please feel free to continue to put those in. I'm going to jump back into our slide deck too. So again, go ahead and put those in our brainstorming activity. And hopefully when I share some of how I approached assessment, maybe if you're thinking about this more, there will be some ideas that come to mind. So now let's look at really the assessment activities and some of the data that I've collected with an eye toward the future. So I want to point out that my assessment was driven by inquiry. So in terms of indirect assessment, I wanted to know if students were using the content throughout the semester, when they were working through content, and how long they took to work through content. Those were useful indirect assessment points for me. I wanted to know formatively how clearly and effectively content explained information literacy concepts to students, and how well students could apply information literacy and information seeking concepts in their own practices along the way. And then in a summative nature, I wanted to understand how well students understood information literacy and those information seeking concepts, excuse me. And then how many attempts did it take them if they were trying to attain a passing grade? How long did it take them to get there? And then if there were any common wrong answers or misconceptions or points of confusion. So these were the questions that really formed how I looked at the data I collected and how I approached assessment. So I just want to show you some samples of indirect, formative, and summative assessment data that we gathered through our learning management system. And again, as Liz asked, part of the reason that I created this as a standalone resource was because it allowed me to retain control over the content and the assessment data. Whereas if I had been in instructors' courses, I wouldn't have had that control, or I wouldn't have had been able to manage the content, like next semester, say, if they didn't add me again. So this log information gives me number of users and views from within the LMS, and that helped me understand the number of students who were using the content throughout the semester. Whereas more specifically, data about who completed what activity when, address when students worked through the content. So it gave me a sense of when students were actually participating in this online learning resource. On the back end, I could also see how long it took for students to complete the activities, which is helpful for me as someone who notoriously underestimates the amount of time that it takes to do things, including apparently this session today. But for formative assessment, I was able to look at their responses to questions to really understand how clearly and effectively the content explained information literacy and those information seeking concepts. So, when students are asked to identify keywords and phrases, how well do they do? Where are their common stuck points, and where are there points where I could provide additional instruction? And then again, some of the questions had sort of pre-slugged answers, and it asked students to reflect on their own behaviors and whether different resources helped them to find different information. So again, here, I'm looking at how well students can apply information literacy and those information seeking concepts in their practices. As we flip into the summative assessment data, that more quiz level data, the quiz scores helped me to see how many attempts it took for students to earn those credentials, which gave me a sense both of their understandings, but also the clarity perhaps of the content. And I can dive more deeply into this content and see specific answers to each question, which allows me to identify if there are those common misconceptions or areas where students consistently answer incorrectly. So again, here, if we can continue to look deeper and deeper, even at the more individual student level, to see if there are specific responses or specific issues that arise where I could explore creating additional resources or more effectively embedding information literacy instruction going forward. So these kinds of assessment things that were just like built right into our learning management system allowed me to reflect on those points of inquiry and identify new takeaways that I had never gathered before pre-COVID. So indirect assessment helped me to identify that students work through the content either right away or at the end of the semester. They're not lingering on activities, so maybe there are ways for me to build in more reflection or thoughtfulness, and that their time varies widely often on these activities, but it informs what I can give them as a realistic expectation for how much time they should allot for these activities. In terms of formative assessment, it seems like the content is clear, but we have certain ideas that we're always struggling with on our campus, and phrase searching is always one of them. And it's no different with my students here. And generally, they seem to able to apply the concepts, but I need to figure out more ways to provide immediate feedback so that they're getting an immediate response and some constructive guidance as they go forward. And then the summative assessment helped me to glean that quiz scores suggest they're understanding information literacy, and it takes them about 1, maybe 2 attempts to pass and earn that credential. But again, like I said, phrase searching for us is an issue always and forever. So since we are at our question time, please go ahead and start putting questions into your chat. There's a couple things that I want to highlight. I might mix up my slides a little bit just so that we can make sure we get some questions in here. But please go ahead and put questions into chat. And if we have time at the end, maybe we can jump into our last brainstorming activity. Yes, Kim asked if everything was asynchronous. All of this content was asynchronous, and all of the assessment that I did was asynchronous. There were some times when I had face-to-face interactions with students virtually after the fact, but not in this. None of this assessment data was influenced by those interactions. Kathy's asked if I've ever used rubrics in assessing students' final projects. Yes, I have. As a course instructor, I have definitely done that. So not in this case. I have not done that in my liaison responsibilities, but I have done that as a instructor of record in one of our courses. So that might be an area that I could explore further. And Kathy, I have some rubrics I would be happy to just share with you. That would be great. If you want to shoot me an email, I would be happy to share what my colleague and I have used in the past when we have co-taught a course. So Liz asked about how much feedback did I give to students in the course? And actually that's one of my main takeaways, or one of my main next steps, Liz, is that I really want to, I think the amount of feedback that I gave was not enough for students. I'm used to seeing students reading their body language right, and I was not able to do that. And so I think being asynchronous, it was sort of easy for me to be a little bit out of sight, out of mind. So they got automatic feedback that I built into our LMS and into the activities they were engaging with. But in terms of like feedback on their search strategies or feedback on their questions, that was something that in the overwhelmedness of COVID that I wasn't able to do to the level that I really wanted to do. So I foresee that this kind of content will really be the foundation of my instruction going forward. So that's something that I really want to make sure that I can do a better job at, because I think in my like one-on-one orientation kinds of sessions, I feel like I'm not really giving students feedback, but in this kind of a more rich learning experience, I think there's really much more of an opportunity to do that. Yes, and Liz, this was built as a one-shot, just to follow up on that question. So Amy asked about the in-person meetings that I advertised in my course. So basically that was if an instructor said, can you do a face-to-face session with my students? And I said, yes, I can, if they work through this content first. So then we would come together, we would use it as question time. I could highlight some when I looked at the student data on the back end. These were common issues that you all encountered, or these were common things that you all grappled with, or these were common errors that I saw along the way in certain classes. Or if there were specific, like kind of funky strategies to use, or tricky search strategies that I could illustrate. So I tried to make that more active learning, where students could ask questions and be more in dialogue and connect with me and with each other. So the goal was to have the online content kind of be the sit and get kind of content that they might get in a face-to-face session. And then those face-to-face sessions through Zoom or through Google Meet provided more opportunity to discuss and ask questions and get that more personal connection. So not every class that I worked with had those. Some just used the online content, which is totally fine. But I really pushed that if an instructor had asked me for just a straight up virtual session, I thought me talking like this today is not going to effectively help these teachers, these administrators, as they're managing a million other things. They need something that they can go back to and review on their own time. So I really pushed that in a way that I hadn't been able to push in the past, I will say, because because COVID, right? I think that's all sometimes we need to say at this point in 2021. So yeah, and I think it was nice for me to connect with those faculty and those students. It was nice to see faces I hadn't, they're not my normal faces to see in Zoom meetings, right? And it was a really great way to hopefully make, inroads with students who are just beginning their programs and are maybe feeling a little bit lost. So let me talk, I guess, continue to put your questions in, but I just want to, some of these ideas that you've asked about relate to my own conclusions. So I just want to share some of those. So as I've said now, this assessment data from these online learning resources have offered me insight into learners' behavior and thinking that I never had previously. And so what I really think is that assessment data can provide me with additional points of collaboration and connection with my subject faculty, because now I have like hard evidence to demonstrate to them. And this assessment data, I'm hoping, will help me to continue more of a flipped model. So, having some online content that students work through and then having that more advanced or dynamic learning interaction after as a class, whether it's in person or whether it's online. And for me, my next steps then are to integrate more active, engaging kinds of learning options into this content. As you saw, it's pretty basic text and screenshots, but we use H5P on our campus, which is like drag and drop activities and clickable images. So I need to do more of that, but I just didn't have the capacity with COVID. But I also really want to identify a couple of points of connection for subject faculty, perhaps in departments around each, kind of group of assessment data that I have. And then really use this content to develop a menu that my faculty can use to kind of figure out what they need and what their students really need in terms of instruction, and use this as a foundation. So for you then, and for other librarians, what I see as the most useful takeaways are to use those existing technology tools that your institution has to help us gather that indirect, informative, and summative assessment data, whether COVID or not, because those kinds of tools offer us a lot of affordances that are hard to do in one shots. Also, the data that we collect assessment-wise can and hopefully does inform and shape our partnerships that we have with faculty. But hopefully, I collected a lot of data and not all of it will be useful to me. So I would say be selective about the data, because that will allow us to focus on where we can really make impacts or how we can take vast quantities of that information and make it more manageable. So I will jump in. I'm just going to pop it up here since we have just a couple minutes. And if you want to participate, you're welcome to. I'm going to pop that Jamboard in chat one more time. So if there's one instructional question that you have that could be answered using online assessment data and you'd be willing to share it here with us, that would be great. But what I will do is now look at Tom's question, which is if any of your STEM librarians are doing something like you are doing. So it's hard to say. We're all kind of doing different things. I think other librarians have taken different approaches in terms of just kind of replicating what they would do maybe in an in-person setting online in a Zoom meeting, or in some cases, we've had some of our STEM librarians Zoom into in-person classes. So they're on the big screen. But we're really trying, I think, to do more institution-wide, at least introductory instruction online. So we're trying to kind of build up modules that might be useful. I know, for example, our research data librarian just provided some research data instruction to our undergraduate STEM students who are engaging in some summer research in the same kind of approach. So if you're interested in that, please feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to connect you with that person. Debbie says, if you want more like this, come Friday at 11:15. That's great. Second half. Wonderful. I'm glad to hear it's a good companion piece, Debbie, and I look forward to being there. So yes, I know again that we were sort of fast and furious at the end. You got the front row seat to my inability to estimate time even through practice. But I hope that this session was helpful, at least in some ways for you, sparked an idea, gave you a sense of maybe even like, oh, that seems too much for me. That's not feasible. I'll share my email here. If you have any questions or want to contact me, I'll be sharing the slides, the Jamboard, and then I'll also share the link to the online content and the guest login information with Miela so that after the conference you can access that. Does that make sense, Julia? I know you asked for the link to access the content. I feel like that might be the most effective way. But if you want it before then, feel free to shoot me an email and I'm happy to give it to you right now. But just so you don't have to watch me copy and paste or wait for me to copy and paste, that might be a way to get there. But thank you everybody for participating. Thank you everybody for your attention, and I hope you've had a great conference so far, and I hope I see you at Debbie's session tomorrow.
Thank you, everyone. This is Ida again. Thank you, Amanda. That was great. I will remind everyone to try and fill out the evaluation form on the conference portal, and the next sessions start at 3:45. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.